I never imagined that the deepest betrayal of my life would come wrapped in polite smiles, gentle voices, and the word family. The day I realized that my worth was measured not by love, but by what I owned, something inside me quietly shattered. Trust did not break like glass. It cracked like old wood slowly and painfully until the truth slipped through the gaps. This is not a story about losing a house. It is a story about what happens when the people you love forget where home really is, and how far one must go to remain whole. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how our stories connect people from all around the world. Your comments and thoughts bring this community to life, and we're so grateful to have you on this journey with us. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, grab a cozy seat, maybe a cup of coffee or tea, and prepare yourself for a tale that will captivate your heart from beginning to end. Let's begin. My name is Linda Cooper, and I turned 68 last spring under the pale orange sky of Tucson, Arizona. I live alone in a modest one-story ranch-style house along the edge of the desert, where the land stretches out in tones of sand, stone, and thorny brush, and the sky seems to have no ceiling. People often imagine loneliness in a place like mine, but my days carry a quiet rhythm that feels more like peace than isolation. I spent 34 years as a high school counselor, listening to teenagers who believed the world might swallow them whole. When I retired, I promised myself I would continue to live with intention, not simply wait for life to fade into slants. The house where I wake each morning is my greatest earthly possession, but it is more than a legal deed or a line in county records. The walls are stucco, sun-baked and sandy, and the roofline sits low like it is trying to disappear into the desert horizon. Mark, my late husband, and I bought the house when we were still young enough to believe that everything could be solved with work and time. We spent more than 20 years paying the mortgage, saying no to vacations, new cars, and luxury that could not coexist with monthly payments. Fate played one of its cruel jokes when Mark passed from lung cancer the very same year we mailed the final check. I still remember touching the front door frame and whispering that he had done it, even though he was not there to hear it. Every object inside the house has his fingerprint somewhere beneath the surface. He built the wooden shelves in the hallway with second-hand tools and stubborn hope. He carved our initials on the back of the porch swing that still faces the morning light. The yard carries his devotion, too. A single lemon tree stands in the back garden. Like a quiet survivor, I tend to it the way he once tended to me. I have 2 adult children. My daughter Megan lives in Portland, Oregon. She works in the technology field, keeps her calendar full, and apologizes when she cannot visit more often. Her love is steady but spoken through late-night phone calls and well-timed deliveries rather than physical presence. My son Eric still lives here in Tucson. He once confided every secret to me, even those that broke his pride. As he grew older, life grew heavier on his shoulders, mostly in the form of finances and expectations. He married a woman named Jenna, and they have a daughter named Lily, a bright, curious 8-year-old girl who sees wonder in everything that grows, glows, or moves. My relationship with Eric changed slowly, like desert erosion. I could not name the exact moment it shifted. One day, he was a boy clinging to my hand, and years later, he became a man who measured security by money instead of memories. Jenna, his wife, is polite and charming, but her eyes always scan rooms the way people scan store shelves. Her parents, Frank and Dottie, live across town in a rental home that has seen better years. I follow a simple routine. I rise before the desert heat becomes sharp, brew strong coffee, and sit on the wooden swing. Then I drive to the public library, where I volunteer 3 days a week, placing books in the hands of dreamers, my next-door neighbor, Rosa Delgado, sometimes brings homemade tamales and stories from her youth. We are two widows who recognize the value of quiet companionship. I believed that I had already survived my hardest chapters and that the remaining years would unfold gently. At that point, I had no idea that my peaceful home would become the center of a storm I never asked for, and that betrayal could arrive through the very door I thought love guarded. If you're still watching and you can already sense something hidden beneath the surface, please comment number 1 below so I know you're still with me. Now get ready. Chapter 2 is about to reveal the first cracks. The summer heat arrived early that year, carrying a strange heaviness that did not feel like the usual Arizona dryness. The air around my house seemed thicker, as if it held a secret that had not yet decided how to reveal itself. I did not immediately recognize anything as a warning. Changes often appear like gentle ripples before they rise into waves, and at first, I believed it was only coincidence that Eric and Jenna began visiting more often. They arrived with cheerful smiles and light conversation, yet I sensed something rehearsed in their tone, like actors who knew their lines too well. Their visits no longer felt like casual family time. Jenna began to wander through rooms with her coffee mug, letting her eyes linger on shelves, furniture, and framed photographs that had gathered memories over decades. There was no tenderness in her gaze, only silent calculation. When she stood in the hallway, her expression resembled someone evaluating a property listing rather than admiring family history. I tried to look past it, telling myself that I was being too sensitive, that aging sometimes makes the heart overly alert. Soon, the questions began. They arrived softly, hidden beneath polite curiosity. Jenna mentioned rising insurance rates in Arizona as though she wondered about mine. She asked how often maintenance was needed for an older house in the desert climate. She commented on the tax expenses for single homeowners. There was no direct mention of plans, yet each question carried a quiet intention that felt heavier than the one before. I answered politely, but my mind filled with uneasy shadows. Eric also began slipping small hints into his conversations. He spoke about how wonderful it would be if Lily could attend a school only a few blocks away from my house. He noted how my neighborhood was safer and calmer than the one his family lived in. He said that this part of Tucson seemed ideal for raising children. He smiled, but I noticed a flicker behind his eyes that did not resemble the warm boy I once raised. I placed his comments into a mental drawer labeled unsettling, though I still refused to draw conclusions. During one visit, Jenna told me that her parents were struggling with their rental agreement and might soon need another place to stay. She shared it with a quiet sigh, almost as if testing my emotional reaction. I felt sympathy because hardship is not foreign to me. Yet, something about her timing and tone seemed too precise, as if she placed the information like a chess piece rather than a confession. A few days later, while I was sweeping the kitchen floor, Jenna walked toward the back porch and paused to look around with an expression that felt too satisfied. She mentioned that my house looked much larger than what a woman my age needed. The comment was spoken softly, with a sweet smile, but it sank sharply into me like a thorn. I did not argue. I simply nodded and let silence protect my dignity. One evening, my neighbor Rosa mentioned she had noticed Jenna taking photographs around the yard. She did not want to alarm me, but she felt I deserved awareness. When she returned to her home, I stood on my porch and watched the sky turn purple behind the mountains. The desert was silent, yet my heartbeat was not. Something was shifting, slowly but undeniably, like a storm gathering beyond the horizon where no one could yet see lightning. If the tension is beginning to make you curious about what comes next, comment number 2 below to stay with me. Things are slowly shifting, and Chapter 3 will show the first turning point. About a week after the strange questions and unusual visits, a heavy stillness settled into my home like a slow-moving shadow that did not belong to the natural silence of the desert. One Saturday afternoon, When the heat outside had finally eased enough for the cicadas to quiet down, I decided to reorganize my file cabinet. It was something I had done for years, almost like a ritual of order and preparedness. The files were always neatly labeled, placed by category, and secured behind a small metal lock that my husband once teased me for trusting so much. I believed that my privacy was safe because nothing in my home had ever been touched without permission, until that day. When I slid open the drawer, I immediately noticed that the folders were slightly uneven, as if someone had shuffled through them hurriedly. Papers that used to sit flush against one another were sticking out unevenly, and a rubber band I remembered using to secure a packet of insurance papers was missing altogether. My heartbeat changed rhythm as my eyes scanned the labels. When I located the envelope containing the homeownership deed, I saw a faint crease that was not there the last time I handled it. I froze in place, unable to decide whether I was imagining it, or whether someone had, in fact, accessed what only I should have touched. The lock on the cabinet was still shut, but I suddenly remembered that the spare key had always been kept in a small ceramic bowl in the hallway, a place everyone who visited could easily notice. My mind tried to push away the possibility, but a memory surfaced without permission. The last time Eric and Jenna visited, I had stepped away to the kitchen for several minutes while they remained in the living room. I recalled the way Jenna wandered near the hallway table, her eyes drawn not only to the photographs, but also to anything that might hold information. At the time, it felt harmless. Now, that same memory felt like a puzzle piece snapping into place. While I held the folder in my hand, my phone rang. Eric's voice filled the room with a tone that sounded gentle, but something about the pacing of his words felt practiced. He began speaking about how families who planned ahead avoided legal complications in the future. He mentioned that it was better to decide things while everyone was clear-minded. My breath caught when he said that it would be a relief if the house was secured in a way that ensured it would stay within the family. He said it as if he were speaking about a valuable object that requires strategic placement, not a sacred home built from years of shared life, devotion, and hardship. I sat quietly, allowing him to finish, but my heartbeat echoed across my chest like a warning drum. It was the first time my son hinted directly at transferring ownership, and his phrasing carried no warmth, only intent. When the call ended, I remained seated, stunned by the realization that my earlier concerns were not the inventions of an aging mind. Something calculated was unfolding, and the first veil had been lifted. Instead of reacting with anger, I forced myself to breathe slowly. Acting emotionally would only place me at a disadvantage. I pulled out a blank notebook from my desk and began writing down dates, questions, comments, and small events that suddenly felt meaningful. Documenting was no longer a habit. It became a form of armor. I understood that my safety depended on clarity, not confrontation. As the sun dipped behind the distant mountains and the sky turned the color of rust, I stood by the back window, looking at the lemon tree that Mark had planted for the first time. It felt like the house was no longer only a home. It was becoming a target, and I sensed that the quiet war had already begun, even if no one had spoken its name. If you're starting to realize this story may not end the way anyone expects, comment number 3 below. Chapter 4 is where attempts at peace collide with hidden intentions. In the days that followed, my mind became a quiet battlefield where reason and fear fought without rest. I did not want to believe my own son could willingly harm me, even through subtle persuasion. A mother's instinct is to protect, but another instinct, the one shaped by age and experience, whispered that love does not blind one forever. I tried to convince myself that perhaps Eric was overwhelmed, maybe influenced by his wife, or maybe he believed he was being responsible. The conflict inside me grew heavier, but I chose to move slowly and watch rather than confront. I hoped that understanding would present itself before accusations poisoned what was left of peace. From that moment, I began observing with intention rather than emotion. When Eric and Jenna visited again, I paid attention not only to what they said, but how they said it. I noticed how Jenna's eyes never stayed long on me, but drifted around the house as though she were mentally measuring space. Her fingertips brushed surfaces like someone imagining ownership rather than admiration. Eric spoke less than she did, but whenever Jenna mentioned financial matters, he looked at her with a silent agreement that tightened my chest. I smiled through it, even laughed occasionally, but inside, I was taking notes that etched themselves deeply into my memory. One afternoon, I invited Eric for a quiet conversation. I asked gentle questions, the kind a mother might ask without suspicion. I inquired about how he and Jenna were managing finances, how stable their current rental was, and whether they had future plans to buy a house of their own. His answers were vague, wrapped in careful phrasing that avoided offering clarity. When I asked indirectly about my own future living situation, he shifted in his seat and claimed that everyone should consider later life options before it became too late. There was caution in his tone, not concern. I realized then that he had become guarded around me, as if he feared I might interrupt a plan not yet completed. Meanwhile, Jenna continued to sharpen her speaking points with enthusiasm disguised as practicality. During a visit, she explained how more seniors were choosing to move into modern communities where they could socialize, receive support, and avoid loneliness. Her words were smooth, but there was an unmistakable undertone that implied people my age could not manage their own lives. She also spoke about how property left unmanaged often became a burden for the next generation. It sounded like a prepared argument, not conversation. Despite the uneasiness within me, I attempted to pull everyone closer, hoping that warmth could overshadow greed. I organized a small Sunday dinner with homemade dishes Eric had always loved when he was a boy. I set the table thoughtfully, placed fresh lemons in a small bowl at the center, and tried to bring back the feeling of family unity that once lived easily in my home. The evening began pleasantly enough, with soft conversation and a sense of normalcy. However, when dessert came, Jenna casually mentioned that the house could be put to better use in the future, perhaps even upgraded into something more profitable. The word profitable struck me with unexpected force. A home is not a venture, it is an anchor. Later that evening, as they were getting ready to leave, my neighbor Rosa waved at me from her yard. She leaned in close and quietly mentioned that she had again seen Jenna taking pictures along the fence near the backyard, but she was unsure whether it was intentional or harmless. Hearing that felt like a door closing inside me. It confirmed that my quiet efforts had not reversed anything. The storm I sensed was not fading. It was gathering definition. That night, lying in my bed, I understood that love alone could not dissolve what had taken shape. I was no longer simply a mother. I was standing as the last gatekeeper of my own life, and the air around me felt colder than the desert night outside. If you feel the storm is getting closer and the truth is no longer avoidable, comment number 4 below. Chapter 5 will take everything to a breaking point. By the end of that week, the house felt heavier than usual, even though nothing had physically changed. I returned home on Friday afternoon after spending several hours at the local library where I had been helping seniors sign up for digital literacy workshops. That volunteer work always lifted my spirit because it reminded me that there were people who still valued my experience and viewed aging as a strength rather than a burden. The moment I stepped into my kitchen, however, I felt a tightening in my chest, as if my peaceful routine was about to be disrupted by something I could not yet describe. I brewed a cup of chamomile tea and sat at the old oak table that had been with me long before Eric was born. It was a piece of my history, but even history felt fragile at that moment. The sound of a car door closing startled me. I peered through the window and saw Eric and Jenna walking toward my porch. They had not called, messaged, or hinted that they would come. Their unexpected presence stirred uneasiness inside me. The absence of Lily confirmed that this was not a casual family visit. Eric walked in first, wearing a serious expression that lacked the warmth I used to rely on. Jenna followed close behind, carrying a thick folder instead of a bag of groceries or a simple dessert like she once would have. She placed it on the coffee table as if preparing for a meeting rather than a conversation within family walls. The discussion began with well-rehearsed sentences dressed as concern. Words such as financial management, safety planning, and future optimization flowed as though they had been memorized from an article or a legal consultation. Jenna described the house as oversized, underutilized, and impractical for someone my age. She mentioned long-term planning and efficient allocation of space as if she were talking about an office building rather than the place where I raised my son and rebuilt my confidence after divorce. Eric nodded through her speech without meeting my eyes. His silence was more painful than her logic. Then, at one point, everything shifted. Eric finally spoke, and his words were not a suggestion or a question. They were a demand, disguised as practicality. He said the sentence that sliced through every memory and every sacrifice I had stored within these walls. He asked where his wife's parents would stay if I did not consider making adjustments. My hearing sharpened, and for a moment, I could not feel my own hands. It was no longer about my health, my comfort, my future, or my independence. It was about accommodating another family that had no connection to the sweat, love, and years embedded in the beams of this home. Jenna's posture straightened, and her tone shifted from polite persuasion to confident expectation. She spoke of rearranging rooms, converting my sewing studio, and planning a shared household structure. Her vocabulary sounded like a project proposal rather than an invitation for family unity. I no longer felt like the homeowner or the matriarch. I felt like an obstacle, a placeholder, and an unused storage unit blocking their renovation blueprint. Inside my chest, a dull ache spread, not from age, but from betrayal. I did not argue. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I simply observed them as if they were strangers analyzing a real estate listing. When they finally left, the silence of the house transformed. It was no longer peaceful. It was wounded. I walked slowly through each room and realized that what hurt was not greed or planning. It was the coldness of being unseen, unvalued, and unconsidered by the person I once carried in my arms. In that stillness, I finally understood that the real threat was not losing the house. It was losing myself inside it. I barely slept that night, not because of fear, but because of a painful clarity that kept echoing through my thoughts. I lay in my bed with the lights off, staring at the faint glow of the digital clock on my nightstand. Each passing minute reminded me that time was moving, whether I acted or hesitated. My pillow felt damp from tears I did not even remember shedding, and my breath shivered every time I recalled my son's voice asking where his wife's parents would stay. I kept wondering when my role had changed from mother to caretaker, from provider to stepping stone, and finally to an unwanted barrier. The silence inside my home was no longer gentle. It felt like an unspoken warning. As dawn crept through my curtains, I sat up slowly and wrapped a shawl around my shoulders. I walked into the kitchen and made a cup of hot lemon water. Even though my hands trembled slightly, I placed the cup on the table and sat without drinking it. For the first time, I allowed myself to examine my life as if it belonged to someone else. I recalled raising Eric alone while managing long shifts at the school and sewing late into the evening. I worked when I was sick, discouraged, or lonely, and never once allowed him to feel a shortage of anything essential. I remembered how happy I had been when I purchased my home, and how proud Eric used to be when speaking about it. Somewhere along the way, he stopped seeing it as my accomplishment, and began seeing it as his entitlement. I considered the possible outcomes. If I agreed to their plan, I would lose the place that held every piece of my personal story. I would lose privacy, control, independence, and identity. If I fought back openly, I risked permanent damage to my relationship with Eric, which already felt fragile. I even imagined myself complying, stepping aside, forcing a smile while strangers occupied the most intimate corners of my life. Every version of that vision felt suffocating. The heaviness I felt was not about property, it was about dignity. Something inside me shifted. I felt an old version of myself reawakening, the same strong woman who once packed lunches at dawn, paid bills with coins, and taught myself sewing without classes or guidance. If I had survived far worse with far less, I could certainly face this moment. I no longer saw myself as the victim in their story. I saw myself as the author of mine. I stood and walked into the small room that served as my sewing studio. The early morning light fell across the framed family photographs, and the shelves filled with folded fabric. I opened the drawer where I kept important documents, and I placed my hand on the envelope that contained my property records. It felt heavier than paper. It felt like armor. I was not ready to announce anything, and I would not give them the satisfaction of dramatic confrontation. Silence, patience, and strategy would be my approach. I took a deep breath and whispered to myself that I would make a plan and seek guidance outside the circle that threatened me. I did not need permission, validation, or approval. I simply needed to protect what was mine, legally and peacefully. Life had taught me that strong decisions are not always loud. Some are whispered in empty rooms before the world ever hears a sound. When I finally closed the drawer, my chest felt lighter. I walked to the hallway mirror and studied my reflection. There were lines along my cheeks and silver strands among my hair, but I recognized courage in my eyes. I straightened my posture. The moment of choice had arrived, and I had chosen myself. If you're still here and you feel the shift from pain to strategy, comment number 6 below so I know you're following every layer. Now, prepare for Chapter 7. Consequences always reveal character. In the days that followed my quiet decision, the air around my home felt different, as if the walls themselves sensed a change in the rhythm of my life. I did not announce my choice to anyone, yet something about my energy must have shifted because the distance between my family and me began to show in small, almost invisible ways. Eric did not call as frequently, and when he did, his tone carried a faint impatience, like a person checking the progress of a delayed plan rather than showing interest in my well-being. Jenna stopped sending casual messages about Lily's school activities or weekend recipes. The silence did not arrive dramatically. It arrived slowly, like fog creeping across a field until nothing looked familiar. Although I knew this emotional distance was a possible consequence, it still struck my heart with unexpected force. There were moments when I sat with a warm cup of tea in my hands and wondered whether protecting my dignity meant losing my son piece by piece. I tried to find comfort in logic, but motherhood rarely follows logic. There was a pulse of grief beneath every rational thought, reminding me that love carries pain that cannot be negotiated like property rights. I could not forget the soft-spoken boy who once clung to my arm during thunderstorms, believing that I was the only person who could protect him from the unknown. As my emotions shifted, so did the behavior of Eric and Jenna. Their visits became less warm and more observational. They appeared at the door without warning, using casual excuses, but their eyes scanned the house with silent calculation, as though expecting visible changes that might affect their imagined plan. I caught them glancing at drawers, storage boxes, and document shelves, not openly enough to accuse them of searching, yet obviously enough to unsettle me. Once, through the living room window, I saw Jenna speaking briefly with a neighbor, wearing a polite smile that felt rehearsed. My instincts told me she was gathering information, not building community. Though the tension was silent, it pressed against my chest like a weight I could not remove. At night, I lay in bed replaying every part of my motherhood journey, wondering where love had turned into entitlement. I remembered saving loose change and cheese, sewing until my fingers bruised, and whispering encouragement into Eric's ear when he doubted himself. I remembered promising him that no matter how difficult life became, he would always have someone who believed in him. Never once did I imagine that my greatest sacrifice might become the very reason my value was diminished. The emotional conflict within me did not fade. It expanded, filling the spaces between memories and reality. I questioned whether I had raised him to be too comfortable, too trusting in stability, unaware that everything he now viewed as automatic was once the result of daily struggle. Part of me longed to sit him down, hold his hands, and remind him of every milestone we survived together. Yet the stronger part knew that some lessons cannot be spoken. They must be lived. One late evening, I walked through the house with all the lights off, letting only the moon illuminate familiar corners. I paused in the hallway where framed photographs hung like silent witnesses. I touched the glass over one picture that showed Eric as a young boy holding a handmade kite, smiling with pure pride. I felt my heart pull toward the past, but I did not allow myself to drown in nostalgia. Instead, I whispered in my mind that love must evolve, even when it hurts. Looking through the window at the dark horizon, I sensed that the battle ahead would not be loud, but deeply personal, requiring a quiet strength I had spent years unknowingly preparing for. The morning after my longest, heaviest night, I woke with a determination that felt new, yet strangely familiar, like strength that had always lived inside me, but had been sleeping under layers of trust and habit. I sat on the edge of my bed for several minutes, letting the light from the window fall across my hands. They were older now, lined with age and dotted with freckles, yet they were still the same hands that once pushed through obstacles far greater than emotional betrayal. I reminded myself that heartbreak alone could not build a plan, but clarity and preparation could. I whispered silently that pain was not a destination, it was a signal. My first step toward protecting my life and my independence was knowledge. I walked to my small sewing room, closed the door, and began gathering every piece of documentation that represented my autonomy. I organized folders containing my property deed, tax history, insurance coverage, identification records, medical history, bank statements, and proof of income from selling custom clothing. Seeing my documents neatly arranged restored something inside me. It reminded me that I was not helpless, not fragile, and not dependent. I still possessed the legal and mental capacity to defend myself. I spread the papers across my desk and evaluated each category with sharp focus. I examined the current value of my home, calculated my existing savings, and estimated my steady income from sewing and tutoring. I listed living expenses, healthcare needs, and potential emergency funds. When I finished, I realized something deeply empowering. I was not standing on shaky ground. I had the means to remain independent for many years if I planned carefully. That realization lit a fire of confidence that washed over lingering sadness. The next decision required secrecy. I would not choose a local attorney where information could travel quickly through neighbors, social circles, or community networks. Instead, I searched discreetly and selected a law office located 2 towns away, known for experience in property rights and senior protection. I wrote down the number, planned the journey, and stored the note inside my personal planner. However, even strong people need allies. There was only one person I fully trusted, a woman named Gloria, whom I had known since my first months in town. She was the kind of friend who spoke honestly without sugarcoating reality, and her loyalty had been proven through decades of shared hardships. When I met her at a quiet corner table in a small cafe, I explained what had happened. She listened with her hands folded, her eyes steady, and her face reflecting both concern and validation. She confessed that she once experienced something similar, though the details differed. Her voice, though calm, carried the weight of lived wisdom. She offered to accompany me when I visited the attorney so that I would remain supported but unnoticed. Her presence gave me the strength to acknowledge that I was not alone. That evening, I wrote out the first version of my protection plan. It included legal consultation, asset security steps, communication limits, emotional boundaries, and future housing options if necessary. It was the first time in weeks that my thoughts were arranged with clarity rather than confusion. I chose peace over reaction, strategy over confrontation, and dignity over fear. Before going to bed, I placed the folder containing my documents into my handbag and set it near the front door. As I switched off the lights, I understood that I was no longer waiting for someone else to decide my fate. With a calm and steady breath, I accepted that the woman who would walk out of that door tomorrow was not broken. She was prepared. If you're ready to see how strength, dignity, and self-respect reshape destiny, comment number 8 below. It is time. Let's move into the final chapters and uncover the ending. The day I had been preparing for arrived quietly, without dramatic lightning or echoes of warning. Gloria picked me up early in the morning, and we drove to the attorney's office with my folder resting on my lap like a final piece of armor. I watched the town pass by through the car window, memorizing familiar trees, storefronts, and sidewalks that had shaped so many chapters of my life. I felt sadness, but not regret. When we reached the law office, the attorney greeted us professionally and guided me through a detailed explanation of my legal authority, confirming that I remained fully competent and had every right to make decisions without anyone's consent. Hearing those words strengthened my heartbeat. He laid out all my safest options, but I already knew the path I would choose. I wanted closure, not negotiation. I signed the documents required to sell the house to a buyer who valued privacy, did not seek personal involvement, and agreed to complete all processes rapidly. The attorney finalized the timeline and assured me that within a few days, everything would be legally irreversible. As I placed my signature on the final form, it felt like sealing a chapter rather than losing one. I had not been defeated. I had changed directions. Next, I visited a modest but pleasant apartment complex recommended by Gloria. It was located near a small lake and surrounded by quiet walking paths shaded by tall trees. The unit available for rent was bright, with clean hardwood flooring and a small balcony where I could plant herbs or drink warm tea in the morning. There was no grand staircase, no empty rooms, and no pressure to maintain unnecessary space. It felt like a place designed for peace, not performance. I signed the lease and arranged a moving date with no hesitation. 2 days later, as I was organizing a few belongings into labeled boxes, I heard a car pull into the driveway. Eric and Jenna entered the house without waiting for an invitation, carrying an energy that felt more like enforcement than concern. They asked about paperwork and future arrangements. When the moment was right, I spoke with a calm tone that did not tremble. I informed them that the house no longer belonged to me or to anyone in our family. I had sold it legally, and the new owner would take possession soon. They froze, unable to form a full sentence. Jenna's shock turned quickly into anger, while Eric seemed to crumble from the inside. I did not raise my voice or justify myself. I did not list the sacrifices they had forgotten or the wounds they had caused. I simply stated that I protected what I built and secured my independence. Their reactions belonged to them, not me. After they left, I placed my hand on the living room wall for the last time. I thanked it silently for shelter, memories, and lessons. When I walked out, I carried no property, no bitterness, and no surrender. Carried freedom. Weeks passed in my new apartment, and I began to understand how silence could feel different depending on where it lived. In my old house, silence had become a sign of uncertainty, a reminder of someone waiting to take what was mine. Here, it felt like fresh air, like something granted rather than stolen. I settled into a gentle routine that suited my pace, not anyone else's expectations. In the mornings, I walked along the edge of the small lake, listening to birds instead of worries. My steps no longer felt heavy, and my thoughts no longer circled the same emotional battlefield. I was living slower, but I was finally living on my own terms. Every so often, memories returned, not to haunt me, but to be acknowledged. I allowed myself to recall everything I had endured, and instead of feeling broken, I felt seasoned. There was dignity in knowing that I had acted with reason and calm, even when my heart strained with betrayal. I realized strength was not always revealed through objections or raised voices. Sometimes it existed in quiet decisions, in choosing not to surrender to pressure disguised as love. The woman who once doubted her worth was gone. What remained was someone who chose herself without apology. Over time, I developed a softer understanding of family bonds. I learned that love can coexist with disappointment, and that forgiveness does not require forgetting, nor full reconciliation. Blood does not automatically guarantee loyalty, and sacrifice is not always repaid with gratitude. Yet, holding resentment would only become a new prison, and I had worked too hard to free myself from the old one. I accepted that everyone walks through life carrying their own fears and desires. Sometimes those desires grow large enough to overshadow decency. Recognizing this did not excuse what had happened, but it allowed me to move forward without bitterness. From everything that happened, the most important lesson emerged. No matter the age, everyone deserves the right to protect their dignity, their independence, and their personal truth. I learned that love with boundaries is healthier than love that demands the surrender of identity. Growing older does not mean stepping aside, nor becoming invisible. Life continues to hold value at every stage, and decisions should be shaped by wisdom, not fear. Then one afternoon, my phone chimed with a simple message from Eric. He asked if I was well and said he had been thinking about me. There was no mention of the house, no hint of anger, and no insistence on discussing the past. I sat quietly, feeling a mixture of relief and caution. I did not rush to reply. Healing should not be hurried, and trust should not be granted before it has somewhere safe to stand. I knew that if our relationship rebuilt someday, it would be based on mutual respect, not assumption or possession. As evening fell, I stepped onto my balcony with a warm drink and watched the sun reflect on the water. The breeze carried a tender sense of closure. For the first time in years, I did not feel like I belonged to a house, a role, or a burden. I belonged to myself. I breathed in deeply and understood that my story was not one of loss, but of reclaiming purpose. Respect is not inherited, it is upheld. And freedom at any age is worth the fight. Sometimes life reveals that the greatest battles are not fought with loud declarations, but with quiet choices that honor self-worth. Security, dignity, and emotional independence are not selfish goals. They are the foundations of a peaceful old age. When love becomes a currency instead of a gift, the bravest act is to protect one's boundaries without hatred. No matter how late in life clarity arrives, it is still on time. Every ending can also be a beginning when we choose growth instead of resentment, and when we understand that freedom is not given, it is claimed. May this story remind us that wisdom is not found in surrender, but in thoughtful courage. Thank you for watching. Please share your reflections in the comments below, and do not forget to follow and subscribe so we can continue reflecting, learning, and growing together.